It was 9 o'clock in the morning and Debbie was sound asleep in the multimedia classroom. Little did she know that a lot of students had piled outside the classroom in the doorway. Soon, she began to stir awake due to the clamor of the crowd. With her head still lying on the desk, her eyes slowly opened, and the students came into her view. They were pointing at her, with disdain written all over their faces. It took the oblivious young lady a few seconds to clear her mind, before she finally comprehended what they were whispering from afar. Is she Debbie Nian? Shame on her. She made an ass of our university. That one. She's just a tomboy. How dare she try to seduce Mr. Huo? Exactly. She brought shame to our university. How can she just sleep after what she's done? Bang! All the gossiping was interrupted by a loud thud. When they followed the direction of the sound, they saw Jared standing up and shooting them a fierce glare. The crowd scattered away in a panic. As much as they disliked Debbie, after the rumor got out, no one dared to play with fire by pissing off Jared. Everyone knew that the guy came from a wealthy family and was with a bad temper to boot. No one would wish to be on the receiving end of Jared's wrath, except for, well, 2 boys who stayed by the door. As they seemed to originate from affluent families themselves, Jared's outburst had very little effect on them. With an unattractive sneer, one of them named Benton Xiao spoke to Debbie in a loud voice. I heard you love Mr. Huo. Is that true or what? Sitting upright in her seat, Debbie got up so fast that she experienced some mild vertigo. What? Whom do I love? Mr. Huo? She thought, clearly confused with the situation. From a look of bewilderment, Debbie's facial expression turned dark. A crease formed between her eyebrows as she finally realized the boy's allegation. Taking a deep breath, she put on her best menacing look. Says who? She asked and rolled her eyes at them. I swear if I find out who it is, she thought indignantly, I will beat the shit out of that guy. Strangely enough, her question only threw the 2 boys into a fit of laughter. What's so damn funny? She demanded. Ha ha ha. Don't you know? The fat one named Eric Zhang asked, sharing a look with his companion. You're famous now. The whole world knows that you love Mr. Huo. That's right, said Benton Xiao with a buzz cut, nodding as he smirked at her. The whole world heard you when you shouted, Carlos Huo, I love you, in the grove. And as Benton Xiao attempted to mimic her, his voice turned shrill and whiny. It was nothing like how Debbie truly sounded, but then again, his intentions were clearly less about reenacting in a realistic way and more about taunting her. Dumbfounded, Debbie was at a loss for words. While it was true that she had yelled those words in the grove, there was no one else there who could have heard her. So why, all of a sudden, did everyone know about that? No. Wait a minute, she thought, still seated as she racked her mind for any clues or ideas. During that time, she recalled that there was a man behind the tree. Curtis. Curtis was there. She frowned. Was he the one who spread it around? It had to be him, she considered, glaring with pursed lips as the 2 boys seemed to enjoy watching her boil in anger. Lowering her head a bit, she swore under her breath. Turning to the 2 boys, she shouted aggressively, Shut up the both of you! And when they did not stop laughing, Debbie shoved her table in outrage. The legs of the desk made a shrieking sound against the floor as it was pushed forward. Fuck off. Being scolded by a girl did not bode well for the 2 angry boys. It was the first time that they had been told off by a girl in such an unruly manner. Once or twice they had heard in the past that Debbie was not someone to be bullied or disturbed. In hindsight, they should have known better than to assume that it was just a joke. Benton Xiao shared a look with Eric Zhang, who stood at 5 feet 5 inches and weighed 105 kilograms. Then at the same time, they stepped into the classroom and walked towards Debbie. When Benton Xiao got close, he picked up Debbie's book from the desk that had been shoved earlier and threw it on the floor casually. The ends of his lips went up to form a dangerous smirk. As soon as things appeared like it was about to escalate in the classroom, Most of Debbie's classmates quickly fled the area. For a moment, the two boys assumed it was because of them. On the contrary, it was because they saw the look on Debbie's face. She was about to teach them a very hard lesson. Damn it! Are they idiots? How dare they provoke Tomboy? We better run away as soon as possible. Otherwise, we're going to get caught up in the fight too. They all thought. So in less than a minute, the classroom cleared out like there was a zombie outbreak, leaving the two boys, Debbie, and her friends, calm and collected. Unlike her disposition a few minutes ago, Debbie leaned back in her chair and stared at the two boys with a sweet smile. The two boys widened their eyes. One smile from her disarmed them completely, and they almost forgot why they were there in the first place. They thought she looked so pretty, and began to wonder why they had not noticed it sooner. While the two boys were busy drooling over Debbie's bewitching face, the young lady suddenly bent over to get the book on the floor and smashed it against the face of the boy who had dropped it a while ago. Keeling over, Benton Shao cried in pain. "Bitch, how dare!" "Ow!" he wailed. Before he was able to finish his sentence, a fist came in contact with his face. There was no doubt that the punch was going to leave a very big, fat black eye. Before anyone could retaliate, Jared withdrew his fist and blew on his fingers. He sat back and looked at the two boys incredulously. "Are you guys idiots? What's gotten into your small brains that you're provoking our Debbie? You are courting death, I'm telling you," he said in an indifferent tone, folding his arms. Meanwhile, a thermos was chucked towards Eric Zhang. "Ouch!" he cried in pain, covering his head. "You, just wait and watch," Benton Shao threatened, and took out his phone with his shaking hands. After dialing a number, he put the phone against his ear. "Bro, I'm being bullied in the multimedia classroom on the 3rd floor. Bring more guys, and come quickly." These rich kids did not care about the school regulations one bit. All they wanted was to pick a fight, and frankly, Debbie could not care less. "What a pointless fight, disturbing my sleep," thought the exhausted young lady. Grabbing the desk towards her seat, she reclaimed the same position that she had been in before her nap was interrupted, and murmured, "Wake me up when they're here." Her outright disregard for their attempt to intimidate her only enraged them further. Gently, Jared tapped on her shoulder and said, "Hey, don't sleep just yet. Let's beat these two first." Recently, he had been hanging around Debbie more often, and as a result, he had been getting into fewer fights with others. It did not occur to him until then that he was so bored, so he was thrilled that he could beat these guys up. Sighing, Debbie stood up, and with a lazy stretch, she kicked the chair towards Benton Shao, who was the nearest one. As the boy cried in pain, Jared failed to hide the amusement in his eyes. It did not even require a lot of effort to take care of the entitled brat. As it was, the boy already appeared to have lost before the fight even began. He bent down to rub the sore spots on his legs where the chair had hit him, groaning. Meanwhile, Eric Zhang walked towards Casey. It was she who had hit him with a thermos before, and he wanted to teach the girl a lesson. While standing beside Casey, Dixon and Christina cast a scornful glance at Eric Zhang. Was he really going to attack Casey when it was 3 against 1? "Boy, come here. Let me teach you how to fight," Christina said as she tied up her long curly hair with an elastic band. She crossed her arms before her chest, waiting for him to come over. The atmosphere became tense in the classroom. The two boys could not help but shiver as there were 5 of them, and their backup had not arrived yet. What had they gotten themselves into? Although there were 5 of them, however, Dixon was a straight-A student who did not like to handle things with a pair of fists. So as per usual, he stood by the door to keep watch. Before the reinforcements could make it to the classroom, the two boys were already beaten to a pulp. Getting up from the floor, Benton Shao covered his swollen head and pointed at Debbie, yelling, "Beat that bitch up! She BEA." Before he could finish his sentence, a man's voice came from outside the classroom. "What is going on in here?" Everyone's attention was directed to the man standing in the doorway, and when they realized who it was, they only had one thing on their mind. Oh, since Dixon got terribly absorbed in watching the fight, He had failed to notice the man's appearance in front of him and did not get to warn his friends. Behind the man, a lot of people gathered in the hallway. The tall and thin figure entered the classroom with slow, deliberate steps. It was Curtis, their principal. A refined scholar, well-mannered, and generally affable. It was disquieting to receive a reproachful look from the man. Sure enough, all the involved students ended up in the principal's office. Even the ones who had arrived at the scene as reinforcements, but did not get the chance to throw a single punch, were called in. With that, at least a dozen of them stood in a row before Curtis, their heads bowed down. They were no stranger to Curtis' identify. Aware that the man was from the Liu family, they did not dare to offend him, or even utter a word to him. Nevertheless, they were called to the office for one purpose, and that was for Curtis to find out how the fight began. No one wanted to be the first to squeal. For this reason, all of them stared at the floor, the ceiling, anywhere, but into the principal's eyes. "Tell me what happened," Curtis said. Being 30 years of age, he was more matured than the boys in front of him. His voice was low, and in some of the young ladies' opinions, attractive. When Benton Shao attempted to open his mouth and say something, he was immediately stopped by Debbie's murderous look. The guy grumbled, "I guess you know how to fight, hun?" He thought while frowning. "I'll hire a skilled fighter to beat you up someday. Let's see what you can do then," he swore to himself. With a keen eye, Curtis, of course, noticed the exchange between Debbie and the boy. As the young lady had her head down, she had no way of knowing that his eyes were particularly fixed on her. Debbie Nian? Whom does she resemble in character? Maybe she has developed such an attitude because of the long absence of mother. Curtis thought to himself and sighed. Pushing the glasses up against his nose with an index finger, he asked the names of everyone in front of him and typed them on his computer. Then he sent an email to the dean. Something did catch the student's attention, though. He did not even turn to Debbie and ask for her name. Everyone, including Debbie, was perplexed by it, and only then did they look at Curtis with wondering eyes. Did the principal know her? There was a time in Carlos' life when his so-called wife was absent, but this particular moment in his life was no longer that time. The woman he had married immediately replied to his text message saying, "There is no need for us to meet, Mr. Huo. I'm very busy and I don't have the time. Don't get me wrong. I don't need a single penny from you, so I don't think you need to discuss anything more with me. Please, sign the divorce agreement as soon as possible." Carlos allowed himself to laugh at the silly situation he found himself in. Interesting that my wife doesn't want my money. She just really wants to go her separate way. He thought to himself. If the still married man remembered it right, his wife was at her early 20s and was still a college student. In his view, girls the age of his wife would only bother themselves with material things that only money could buy, such as designer clothing and bags. Her father, Artie Nian, passed away long ago. Why would she choose to divorce me now? The man thought to himself. He could not help but remember Debbie, the girl who had kissed him in the bar that night. He had asked some of his men to investigate the 21-year-old girl. Debbie is so young, yet she is already so good at seducing men. She and my wife are both at their early 20s. Could it be that my nominal wife is having an affair with someone else? He wondered to himself and realized he did not have to guess. He could just ask his wife himself, "Are you going to divorce me for some other guy?" Carlos typed on his device, sending the text to the young girl. If that was truly the case, he could sign the divorce agreement now. He was never really a man who dawdled. The only reason why he had not signed the agreement was because he felt very guilty for being so neglecting, and he wanted to compensate for his absence in their marriage during these years. After all, he had been busy working in the past 3 years and had never paid any attention to her. The marriage existed only as a contract both parties agreed to. However, it seemed that his wife did not want the title of Mrs. Huo at all. She had kept a low profile all these years, and only a few men who worked for Carlos knew that she was his wife. He silently waited in suspense for Debbie's reply, which now took about a few minutes. When he received the text, he began to understand why she had taken so long to reply. Her text was a long and detailed narrative that said, "Yes, I have feelings for another guy, but rest assured, I have not done inappropriate things. I have kept an arm's length from him. Could you please sign the agreement soon so that it would no longer have to be this way and so I can pursue my own happiness? Thank you. The text surprised Carlos as he was not expecting his assumptions to be correct. The truth was she was lying. Yes, she had had a thing for a boy, but it was ages ago. She had already moved on. She only said this to her husband because she wanted him to sign the agreement as soon as possible. She did not think a successful man like him would just allow his wife to love someone else. At this point, she was getting really annoyed and started thinking to herself what a slow man her husband was. Why can't he just pick up that pen and get it over with? She thought. He acts as if he has a thing for me, and it's ridiculous. The girl perceived herself as a reasonable and considerate person. Her husband had been spotted with an actress once before, and then caught shopping with a so-called celebrity. If she really had feelings for her husband, her heart would have been shattered to pieces. But to this day she felt nothing but apathy. She just couldn't understand why Carlos just couldn't sign the agreement. This time, however, Carlos agreed on one condition. I will sign the papers as you wish, but you have to tell my grandpa about it first. If he says it's all right, then I will tender the divorce papers immediately. The man sent the text to the young girl and thought, this marriage was arranged by Grandpa, so I can't divorce her without his permission. When Debbie received the text, she found herself caught up in confusion. His grandpa? Who in the world is this man's grandpa? She wondered. I don't even know who his grandpa is. How am I supposed to tell him about my divorce? Debbie scratched her head in frustration. When her father was still alive to make all the arrangements, he had simply handed her a contract of marriage one day and said, you won't regret marrying him. Then the clueless girl had no other choice but to marry Carlos. She had no idea that such arrangements were made by her spouse's grandpa. How was she supposed to know? He's your grandpa. You should be the one to persuade him. Why would you pin this task on me? Your grandpa must be a stubborn old man, and you want me to be the puppet that bears all of his wrath. You brat. Debbie replied to Carlos' text with her lips pouted. This man is so annoying, just like Jail Moo. I hate them both, she reflected. Carlos was amused by the text his feisty wife had sent him. She's such a short-tempered girl. After all, she's still young and I need to be more inclusive, he thought. Alas, no one has dared to speak to me like this before. Carlos shook his head with resignation. Wait, there's another girl who would speak to me like this, Debbie Nian. The man had also begun to become irritated, just as the woman had had a few moments ago. He had bothered himself with Debbie way too many times today. My grandpa is in New York. You may find him now, he replied impatiently. What the fuck? Debbie exclaimed. She was fuming when she raised her hand in an attempt to throw her phone. Luckily, she quickly changed her mind and threw it onto her bed. After collecting herself and calming down, she picked up her phone and finally replied to her annoying husband's text. Carlos Huo, you have the balls to treat me this way. I'm going to New York tomorrow. If your grandpa doesn't say yes, I will stay there until he budges. Do as you wish, the man replied quickly. He then chucked his phone away, like Debbie had done. He did not tell his grandpa himself because he had promised that old man that he would not divorce his wife. If she wanted to divorce him so badly, she should be the one responsible for persuading his grandpa. He thought it was a pretty fair trade and did not understand why his wife went all ballistic. She's so naive and so willfully stupid, Carlos thought. After reading her husband's reply, Debbie was infuriated. She tried so hard to pacify herself. Debbie Nian, calm down. He is your husband, and it was you who agreed to marry him in the first place. Calm down, she told herself. The girl grew more frustrated upon realizing she still had to take large strides to get her useless husband to sign the divorce papers. She couldn't just fly to New York to persuade his stupid spouse's grandpa. She moaned and groaned the whole day when Jared finally snapped. He covered his ears in frustration. What the hell is wrong with you, you stupid tomboy? Just tell me, are you going through the changes of life early? The boy exclaimed. Debbie looked at him with a sad look and murmured, I'm so upset. She kept asking herself over and over again why Carlos wouldn't just sign the papers. What are you so upset for? Just tell us and we'll hear you out. We promise we're here to help you, Jared assured the struggling girl. Christina and Casey seconded the motion and nodded immediately after Jared had made his statement. The troubled girl shook her head with resignation and thought, how can I tell you about that? If I tell you guys Carlos is my husband and that I want to divorce him, you would all think I'm crazy. With this in mind, Debbie flashed a bitter smile. She didn't even have the marriage of certificate as proof in her hands. She could not show her friends any evidence that she was Mrs. Huo. They might even send her to the mental hospital to have her brain checked for anything funny. After all, Carlos still seemed to be distant towards people like her. Damn, Debbie thought. What the hell am I supposed to do now? How about you think about this instead? I was invited to a dinner party this evening. Do you want to come with me? Jared offered. Earlier that day, his father had asked him to go to the dinner party on his behalf. He had originally planned not to follow his father's order, but he thought that if Debbie wanted to go to the party or ever so needed to, he could take her to the party. Out of options, the problematic girl nodded indifferently. She had not been traveling for a long time, and maybe the upcoming dinner party would make her feel better. Casey had to go to her friend's birthday party while Christina had her own family dinner to attend to. Dixon was busy preparing for the entrance exams for the postgraduate school, so only Debbie and Jared were available to attend the evening party. The considerate boy took Debbie shopping so that they could get her an evening dress. He picked a red dress for her that would match her red lipstick. When Debbie saw the dress, her face twitched in discomfort. It was backless and she didn't think it would suit her. You're still my best friend, right? But don't you know me at all? This dress? For me? Seriously? Debbie asked Jared. She did not wear the dress and instead cast a burning glacé that would send Jared right into a guilt trip. But Jared had more evil intentions. The guests this evening are all going to be successful businessmen. You should dress up so that if you develop a crush on someone, you can take him home and, he explained with a goofy grin on his face. Ouch! A sudden scream spilled out of his mouth as Debbie kicked his leg hard before he could finish his perverted sentence. She withdrew her leg, took the dress from the saleslady and entered the fitting room to put it on. Fine, I'll wear this dress, she thought with determination. After all, I'm a pretty girl. After a few minutes, Debbie got out of the fitting room wearing the dress Jared had picked out for her. Jared's jaws dropped when he saw what his best friend looked like. Tomboy, no, Miss Nian, you look like a girl, Jared exclaimed in delight. Are you out of your mind? I am a girl and I've always been a girl, Debbie retorted louder, waving her fist around to threaten him. The red dress embraced her form, falling perfectly on the ground. It was no secret that she looked so stunning that any man could fall head over heels for her. That day was a rather challenging one for the university principal who was tapping his fingers on his desk, lost in thought. However, it was not only Curtis whose mind was bombarded with questions. The students also had questions that needed to be answered, such as how Debbie and the principal knew each other and whether they were closely related. Rumors had it that the girl with a strong personality had an even stronger background. So strong that the Liu family would bend over to cover up the feisty student's mistakes. Is this girl's reputation so strong that even Mr. Liu doesn't dare to offend her? The students continued to contemplate. Suspicion was filling up the principal's office. This was when the principal finally came to a verdict. Curtis stood up from where he was seated and picked up a notice of criticism before releasing an official statement. I've checked and verified the surveillance tape of the classroom incident. I have also seen with my own eyes that Benton Xiao and Eric Zhang started the fight. A notice of criticism will now be printed in the campus newspaper so that it will be circulated all over the university. On the other hand, Jared Han and the other students involved have to sprint 10 laps around the racetrack as a form of punishment. Consider it a consequence of your childish behaviors. As for you, Dixon Shu, though you didn't engage in the fight, you will be watching over your fellow classmates. When they are done serving their sentence in the field, come and inform me. After saying all his orders in just one go, the head of the university kept his silence. Just as Curtis thought he had made himself clear, Benton could not help but complain. "Mr. Liu, it's not fair. Look at my face. It's all bruised and swollen. All of this trouble is just because of Debbie Nian. Are you not going to punish her?" The bloke pointed at Debbie, who barely moved an inch. The stubborn boy couldn't believe that the principal had no intention of punishing the girl who had beaten him up so good. If it weren't for Curtis' influential family, he would have thrown a fit and flipped the table that was right in front of him just to express how infuriated he was. Debbie was just as perplexed as the boy she had beaten up. She questioned the judgment of their principal, suspecting that maybe Curtis knew about her. Not taking any more of the chaos in the order of his school, Curtis flashed a glare at Benton and blatantly said, "Get out of my office. Debbie Nian stays." Although the principal sounded completely calm and composed, the boy, along with his lemmings, did not dare to disobey. They immediately did as the intimidating man said and left, but Jared and his friends were yet to follow them to the door. They did not want to leave Debbie alone with the man. The girl's friends were worried that the principal would pin the whole situation on her. With Debbie's safety in mind, Jared pulled her behind him, faced the man behind the desk, and defended. "Mr. Liu, Debbie didn't want to stir up conflict in the first place. I was the one who asked her to fight. Please don't punish her. Let me take the consequences for my own mess." Curtis smirked, impressed with the ability of the student before him to take responsibility. "I've heard you guys are good friends," the principal pointed out, "and it seems evidently true." Jared nodded proudly and said, "Of course, we are the best of friends, and I'll do anything for my friend, even if it means taking the blame." The boy protecting Debbie had known her for the longest time. It was impossible for him to feel estranged towards her since they had met more than a couple of years back. However, the principal always knew that this was the case. He did his homework and had done extensive research on Debbie's family background, not excluding her friends and how their lives were lived. After all, he would not fall short of investigating even her friends. There was a lot he could tell about the mysterious, ferocious girl just from knowing her friends. "Don't worry, I won't punish her. I just need to ask her some questions. Kindly leave us," the authority patiently said. Jared, being left with no choice but to trust who stood in a higher position than him, decided to obey Curtis. He examined both parties intensely as he was leaving with his friends. The truth was, even he wondered when Debbie and Curtis became closely knitted, since his friend never really mentioned it to him. Little did they know that the girl did not actually know the man who sat with the higher-ups of the university. All she knew was that the principal knew Carlos. Once they were both left alone together in the room, the fearless student decided to take initiative. "Are you going to tell me that you told Carlos about, the thing? I said those words in the grove." Debbie did not have any other idea as to why Curtis asked her to stay. Curtis ignored her question and freed his hand of the paper he was holding. He eventually motioned at the chair before him and offered Debbie to sit. She had no choice but to succumb to her principal's offer. She sat as she was asked to and was surprised to see that someone who was of authority was pouring her a glass of cold water. She immediately tensed up, took the glass and put it on the desk before deciding to say something to break the ice. "Mr. Liu, could you please tell me what you plan to do? You're beginning to freak me out with all this curtsy." Debbie had gotten herself into a lot of trouble before, and whenever she was asked to see the dean, the teachers always shot her looks of pure judgment. She found it strange that the principal did not exhibit any of the things her former educators had lived up to making her feel. Indeed, she was not used to how Curtis was treating her. He looked at her and gave her a friendly smile. "Yes, I heard what you said in the grove, but I didn't tell Carlos about it." In other news, he already asked his secretary to look into who displayed the video during the launch event. "What video?" Debbie thought to herself. "What is this man talking about? What launch event?" Debbie was getting confused. Curtis limited his words and asked her to check the headlines of the news. He asked her to stay for more than just a reason. He had more agendas to fulfill with the girl. He finally cleared his throat and began. "Carlos asked me to drive you out of the university premises. Do you know him? Have you ever offended him?" The one who was overseeing the university had more things to oversee, after all. Being as sharp as he was, the man recollected that at that particular moment, he was watching the launch event live, which took place several minutes before the accident. That was when he had received Carlos' call. The circumstances suggested that Carlos knew Debbie way before the event. I've only met him a couple times before, but mostly during unpleasant encounters. The girl responded, putting a certain sense of trust on the authority of her school's principal. She answered honestly despite the doubts she had building up inside of her. Upon hearing what she had to say, Curtis finally realized why Carlos was so enraged at her. He knew that she was not the best at behaving, which may have caused Carlos a lot of trouble. Finally, the principal looked the student in the eyes. Out of genuine concern, he told her, "Don't worry, you may now head back to your regular classes. As for Carlos' request, let me deal with it. You don't need to bother yourself about it. If you come across Carlos again, remember that it is best to stay away. If you have feelings for him, you must toughen up and lose them. He's dangerous and he's not the kind of man that you should get involved with, much less provoke. Do you understand the things that I'm telling you?" With her mouth opened in awe, Debbie looked at the man before her and wondered how long he had known her and why he was being so nice to her. She thought, "I caused a rumble, but instead of punishing me, he took care of me and protected me from that hoodlum Carlos." The feisty girl began to feel comfort, knowing that the principal concerned himself with her as if he were her parent. She began to feel like she was being treated like his own daughter, and though she could not understand where his worry for her was coming from, she appreciated it. As she was ordered to, Debbie went back to class and immediately inquired her phone for the headline news that Curtis had told her to check out. It was then that she realized what had happened. The person behind the conflict was her cousin, Gail Moo. When Debbie learned about her relative's betrayal, she swore to herself that the next time her cousin provoked her again, she would not let it pass. Meanwhile, at the ZL Group headquarters, inside the CEO's office, Carlos was chucking a cigarette he just finished smoking into the ashtray to sign a document. Without paying attention to anything else, he kept his head low and asked, "Have you found out who was behind all this?" Tristan, who did not have much of a choice but to be honest, answered, "The vice general manager called. His flash drive was infiltrated by a hacker when he mounted it into a device. The hacker was stealthy and swift enough to slip the video into the files, but we still have no leads on who the hacker could be." "Hacker?" Carlos scoffed. "It must be that girl again." The CEO thought to himself in utter ferocity, causing him to form a dent for a smile on his face. Frustrated, Carlos threw his pen out and impatiently demanded to be left alone. "Of course, Mr. Huo," Tristan said. "But before I leave, I would just like to remind you that the Lu Group's anniversary party will be held tomorrow evening. Will you?" Before the assistant could finish his sentence, Carlos interrupted and said, "I will be there. Who will be your partner?" the assistant asked. The last thing Carlos wanted was to concern himself with such trivial problem. He was not particular about details and hated it whenever he had to hesitate before he could figure them out. Women was one of those things he could never understand. However, he knew he had to say something. "How about that woman named, I want to say Olivia Me?" the corporate executive owner said with uncertainty. "Olga Me, Tristan corrected." "All right, her." The stone-cold man nodded indifferently. "Understood. I will now take my leave." The convenient secretary bowed. Once he was left alone, the CEO noticed his phone beep. He had just received a text message. The text seemed to be from a private, unidentified number. Carlos picked up his phone and unlocked it to find a mysterious mail that said, "Hello, Mr. Huo. You may not remember me, but I remember you. I am your legal wife. I will be very much grateful to you if you could take time off your busy schedule to sign the divorce papers I have tendered myself. Thank you very much." After a brief moment of consideration, Carlos scoffed and replied, "I'll discuss it with you face to face tomorrow." Seeing that the girl before him was now a changed woman, Jared took out his phone and photographed the rare beauty that was in front of him. He flashed a cunning smile as he was planning to post her photos in his WeChat moments. After all, his best friend only looked this decent once in a blue moon, so he felt the need to document this moment. "You look stunning. Tomboy, if I didn't know who you truly are, I would court you and ask you to be my girlfriend. The only thing is, you need to wear a thicker bra. Add some padding, maybe. Your chest is so obviously flat." After teasing Debbie, Jared chuckled. Upon hearing his insult, Debbie fumed. She raised her leg in another attempt to kick her annoying friend, but a cold voice stopped her. "Since when is everyone allowed to enter the spirit?" The manager and the salesladies walked towards Carlos to greet him. They were all dumbfounded by his words. What could Mr. Huo be talking about? Who is he referring to? They thought to themselves. Debbie knew that voice and did not have to turn around to confirm who it was. It was her husband, Carlos. She took a few deep breaths to calm herself down and prep herself. "He's trying to provoke you on purpose, Debbie. Just ignore him," she told herself in her mind. She withdrew her leg and told Jared, "I want to change into another dress. This one is way too revealing for me." Indeed, the dress was revealing for a person like her. It was a backless dress that was only hanging on her shoulders with 2 bow knots. Before Jared was able to say something, Carlos' sarcastic voice made its way again. "Really? You call this dress too revealing? Are you from ancient China? Stop pretending to be so conservative and pure." Little did Carlos know that his words would give himself a slap in the face someday. After saying that, he let go of Olga, signaled her to select a dress, and sat on the couch. Olga glanced at Debbie contemptuously and then proceeded to the VIP clothing area with a saleslady, marching as proud as a peacock. Holding the hemlines of her dress in her grips, Debbie walked up to Carlos with a burning look and said, "Are you out of your mind? Why are you coming after me like a mad dog? I was framed to make the love confession. I didn't mean it at all. If you think I'm in love with you, then it's time to stop dreaming. I would never fall in love with a mean person like you." She went over the confession this time as she needed to make it clear that she didn't love him. Otherwise, it would be difficult for her to negotiate the divorce later. Carlos' face soured at her words. The manager wondered if it was right for her to drag the young girl out of the store for Carlos' sake. But before she could decide on that, Jared grabbed Debbie's arm and dragged her out off the premises of trouble. He did not dare to offend Carlos again. "From now on, this girl is banned from this shop," Carlos exclaimed, the echoes of his voice following Debbie. This made Debbie more furious than ever. She could not bear to have her name on the same marriage certificate as this man anymore. She freed her arm from Jared's grip and turned around to challenge Carlos. "Carlos Huo, I'm telling you," before the feisty girl could finish her sentence, her mouth was covered by Jared's big palm. Dragging her over to the counter, Jared chucked a bank card over the top. "We'll have this dress," he told the cashier. "Miss, aren't you going to have your makeup done here?" the cashier asked. The luxurious shop also provided services on top of their products. After all, this was how rich people lived. Jared once again grabbed Debbie's arm tightly whilst shaking his head and saying, "No, thanks. Please be quick. We're in a hurry." The boy was determined to get his best friend out of the store because he knew that she would definitely start a fight with Carlos. He could not allow his beloved friend to offend such a powerful man. She would pay for it forever. When they got all they paid for, Jared led Debbie into his Mercedes-Benz. He let go of her hand, locked the door, and gasped for air. "Open the door. I'm telling you, I am going to divorce that bastard now. Why am I so unfortunate to have to be married to Carlos Huo? Help me, God." Realizing what she had just thought out loud, Debbie stopped her tantrum. Silence filled the car. It was so quiet that if a needle were to be dropped, they would hear it. Jared stared blankly at her in shock of what he just heard. She suddenly realized that even if she wanted her best friend to believe her, she would not be able to, as she had no possession of concrete evidences. All the girl was able to do was lean against the back of the seat and heave a heavy sigh. "It's the truth. I've been married for 3 years and my husband is that stupid, arrogant guy inside that shop. But we only got married for the contract. I've been meaning to divorce him, but he..." Before she could finish, her friend interrupted and said, "Tomboy, stop. You don't need to explain. Don't worry, I understand." Jared glanced at the poor delusional girl. Debbie was pumped thinking that Jared believed her. Jared, I didn't intend to keep it from you guys. After all. Alright. We're going to the mental hospital now. I will take you to the best doctor in the best hospital. Oh no, I'll take you straight to the director of the hospital. Jared held her hand in pity. Don't worry. Even if it's incurable, I will never give up on you. Taking out his phone, Jared opened a navigation application to input their destination, the mental hospital. Debbie furiously snatched his phone to stop him and was rendered speechless for a while. She knew it. She knew nobody would believe her if she told them that she was Carlos's wife. Finally, she opened her mouth and said, "Never mind. Let's go to the dinner party now." Jared cast a few more looks of disbelief before asking her, "Are you all right? Is her disease regressing?" He thought, "Yes, I am totally fine." She helplessly answered with profound resignation. The anniversary party of the Lu group was held on a cruiser named the Ocean, which could carry up to thousands of people. The cruiser was docked at a wharf to the east of Y City. The cruiser was worth $1 billion, and the greatest and biggest corporations would always prefer to hold their parties there. Getting out of the car, Debbie stared at the cruiser, which was emitting pretty warm lights like fireflies hovering over the ocean. She tried to twist her messy hair into a bun. However, her hair was too silky to be tied up and fell down several times until she was finally irritated. She pouted and complained, "I wanted to cut my hair short last time, but Christina intervened and stopped me. I'm so jealous of girls with short hair." Jared smiled as he took out a gray suit and put it on. Then, he took the rubber band in Debbie's hand. He raised her chin with his hand and looked at her. "Since you are unable to tie your hair up, just leave it be. You look nice either way." Although Debbie was boyish, she always paid much attention to her hair, which was shining and smooth. She used expensive shampoos and conditioners to take care of her hair. It was what made her so eye-catching. As for her skin, it was not perfect. Fortunately, her skin was pale, which made her look like a glowing fair maiden. The evening dress would not go with her hairstyle, but her pretty face made up for all that was lost. "Hey, don't you have many lipstick shades? Why don't you put some on?" Jared suggested. He believed that she would look more stunning with some makeup on. Debbie selected a shade from her purse. She chose the one that matched the color of her dress perfectly. She painted over her lips and gave her trusty best friend a smile. "Great. You look nice," Jared said, thankful to see such a pretty face. "Now let's get going." The escort to the Muse threw her purse over to the back seat of his car and took out a pair of high heels which he had bought for his best friend along the way. After Debbie had slipped into her shoes, Jared extended his arms as an invitation. In return, she generously accepted the invitation and held his arm as they boarded the cruiser, which was luxuriously furnished. Many guests had already made their way. Debbie did not always have the opportunity to come to such parties, so she barely knew anyone. The only person she knew took her to the area where they served food, and then he left her alone to scout some women he fancied. Seating herself at a table at the corner of the cabin, Debbie sighted the dark, velvety skies studded with diamonds. Accompanied by the sounds of waves crashing upon the surface of the water as she dined upon exquisite snacks, her mood lifted. A gust of the cold sea breeze blew and kissed her skin. As much as she loved the sensation, Debbie stood up and proceeded to put the window to a tight shut. They all had exited the clothing store with haste, failing to notice that her wrap had been left behind. Fortunately, there was heating in the cabins. Otherwise, she had to think of surviving a possible frostbite. Only accompanied by her shadow, Debbie waited and waited, indulging herself with delicious food. Not once did it bother her that the party hadn't started. Dealing with boredom was simple. Reveling in eating snacks, Debbie felt her throat grow torrid. She went to fetch herself a beverage and overheard a conversation regarding the Lu family. Apparently, they were looking forward to the arrival of an esteemed guest, without whose presence, the party would never start nor the boat sail. Silence shattered. All women shuffled to the door in furor, but the same couldn't be applied to Debbie as she remained seated and eyeballed the scene. All the women seemed to belong in well-heeled families. A big thrill was apparent on everyone's face, but their refinement kept them from shrieking. Within half a minute, Debbie finally knew the source of their excitement. The food section was stationed higher than the others, enabling her to have a view of the commotion at the door clearly. It was him, none other than her husband, the richest bachelor in Y City. They referred to him as, since few people in the city knew about their marriage. The revered guest the Liu family and all the others had been waiting for had finally shown his face. In the moment Carlos showed up, the boat blew its horns, departing to sail the sea. The festivities commenced. Despite possessing such a rowdy personality, Debbie knew when to steer out of trouble. It was never her wish to instigate conflict with Carlos, especially in public. But the petty man himself had been testing her patience. Just like that, Debbie avoided him like a plague. Carlos and his date graced the floor by having the first dance. All had eyes on the two, dreamily sighing as they took in the view except for Debbie as she sneered. The woman was unforgettable for her as she had insulted her at the mall just a few days ago. And there was another couple. Wait, Debbie observed the couple closely. Is that the principal? Curtis Liu, briskly shaking her head. Debbie debated if she was seeing right, especially with the amount of food and beverages she had consumed. Realization struck her mind. She folded her arms. Duh, it's a party thrown by his family. Of course, he'd be here. In a chocolate brown dress, Curtis' date looked chic and stunning. First dance over, claps and cheers echoed throughout the cabin. Even Debbie herself clapped, but solely for Curtis and his date. The crowd dispersed to seize their favorite activities. People gathered here and there while some remained in the cabin or on the deck. They drank, cheered, spoke, and laughed merrily. All seemed happy. However, wise people could see that most people just shared shallow, meaningless things to one another. Sure, they could exchange greetings, be polite, sing and dance, as well as share drinks. But all of this had no substance because none of them would share their genuine thoughts. As for Debbie's friend Jared, who she had come with, she saw him succeed in picking up two girls and flirt with them. A short sigh escaped her lips after she had shaken her head. Hunger sated, Debbie decided to stroll around the deck and savor the view nature offered. The deck was rather crowded. When the wind gusted, she felt the cold sting her skin. It was frigid outside. Heading for the cabin with the intentions of borrowing Jared's jacket, she came to a full stop when she saw how intimate he and one of the girls he had flirted with were as he leaned forward for a kiss. Unable to press on with her own intentions, Debbie turned back. Leaning against the rails, gazing at the sea, she snickered. Jared is a guy after all. I shouldn't be so surprised. Men are considered to be powerless in front of alluring women. An unwelcoming thought perturbed her. If I looked ugly, would Jared still want to be my friend? Debbie? A gentle voice called out, breaking her line of thought. Tucking a lock of her hair behind her ears, she turned towards the voice. It was Curtis. Good evening, Mr. Liu. She greeted politely as he had been with her. Acting tough or authoritative never worked on Debbie. So far, she was fond of the way Curtis taught others, which was soft and gradual, just like his personality. Eyes falling upon Debbie's exposed skin, Curtis sighed as he took off his blazer and draped it on her shoulder. It's cold out here. Why didn't you stay inside? He asked. Warmth filled Debbie's body when she heard Curtis' earnest concern. I ate way too much, so I came out here to make the food settle down my stomach for a bit. Accepting his gesture was something Debbie needed at the moment as she had been freezing in the cool sea breeze. Oh, I see. Curtis looked amused at Debbie's response. Did you come here with Jared? Yes. That lad's a player, he said as he rested his arms on the rails, looking out to the vast sea. He left you as soon as he saw that pretty girl. It's fine. He's single, Debbie tittered. He has the right to be happy and date whoever he wants. The subject then changed. Come, I want you to meet someone. Who? Debbie was lost at Curtis' words. Why would he want to introduce someone to her? Did he treat everyone so nicely? Or was it just her? Instead of offering a response, Curtis stretched out his hand, embodying chivalry. There was not much of a choice. In resignation, Debbie agreed and followed him back to the cabin. Inside the food section, there were 3 people Curtis had led Debbie to Carlos, Olga, and that woman who had shared a dance with Curtis. The sight of the first two made her stomach churn. Carlos, are you kidding me? While Curtis had greeted the three urbanely, his friend Carlos cast sharp glares that could be mistaken for daggers. Every second was torment. Anger welled up inside Debbie's body, taking shape of a bomb that was ticking, ready to explode. Without a word, she turned to leave, but Curtis outstretched his hand and prevented her from progressing. Debbie, this is Carlos Huo, my good buddy. This is Olga me, his date. And this is my girlfriend, Colleen Song. Adjusting his glance to Colleen Song, he smiled. Colleen, this is Debbie Nian. Put on the spot, Debbie inwardly sighed before turning around to face Colleen Song. Ignoring the other two, she sauntered to her and beamed. Guyan. It's nice to meet you. Numerous questions rushed into her mind. In no way were Debbie and Curtis close, so why did he want her to meet his girlfriend? To add, they had never even talked except at school before. Nothing made sense. Tenderly taking Debbie's hand, Colleen Song smiled delicately. Davia. I've heard so much about you. You are so beautiful. Unknowing how to react to the compliments thrown unto her, Debbie turned tight-lipped and just focused on Colleen Song's voice, which was soft and mellow. We're friends now, so if you ever need anything, just ask. Okay? Never did Debbie expect to be flattered to this extent. Both girls had smiles, sharing the tender moment until a voice shattered it into nothingness. Colleen, you must remember, not anyone can be a friend. You need to open your eyes and don't be fooled by the surface as a putrid soul may like within. Both Colleen Song and Curtis looked at Carlos, aghast. Curtis had anticipated that they might not be pleased to see each other, but this was belligerent. Even with Carlos' contempt against women, he had never uttered degrading words to any woman as there was no need to. When a woman came on too strong and struck against him like gum underneath a shoe, a simple sentence uttered from his lips could bring forth hell. What's this all about? Is this because of what Debbie said in the video? Curtis pondered to himself, trying to understand the situation. While Debbie tried to remain her composure and avoid trouble, that man decided to pour fuel to the fire. The bomb exploded. Enough is enough. Snatching the wine glass from Olga's hand, barren of hesitancy, Debbie threw the wine in Carlos' face. Debbie! Curtis was a tad late from preventing a scene. Gaps filled the air as they saw Carlos soaked in wine. Uncontrollable chatter ensued, speaking ill of Debbie. Oh my God! Goodness! What has gotten into that woman? What audacity she has to disgrace Mr. Huo's face with wine. She's out of her mind. Just wait and see. She is as good as dead. There's no way Mr. Huo's taking this lightly. Unfortunately for Debbie, Carlos managed to dodge her aim with ease. Not a single drop of wine fell on him. Usually, that alone was enough to forgive and forget. But not for Carlos. After he had straightened his suit, he cursed her in an icy cold voice. You bloody woman, Carlos! Curtis chimed in instantly before things could get out of hand. It was an accident. Glancing at Debbie, Curtis discreetly motioned for her to agree. But she merely snorted, and threw Carlos an overt, taunting look. Without batting an eye, she declared, No, Mr. Liu. As a matter of fact, I did it on purpose. As soon as the words left her mouth, a pair of burning eyes met her equally intimidating gaze. If one listened carefully, the sound of angry flames crackling could almost be heard in the silence which was fraught with tension. Security! Carlos shouted without looking away. A few seconds later, several guards came running to his aid. What can we do for you, Mr. Huo? They asked promptly. Through clenched teeth, he commanded, Feed this woman to the sharks. Anyone who so much as attempts to save her becomes an enemy of mine. His intimidation worked, because now no one dared to rescue Debbie from what was about to happen. The young lady, however, did not even flinch. Giving back Curtis his jacket, she took off her high heels and braced herself for a fight. Don't you dare! She warned the security guards who were moving towards her. More people turned their attention to the conflict. From afar, Jared, who was already tipsy at that point, suddenly heard Debbie's loud voice. He sprang up from his stool and dashed towards the crowd, abandoning the two girls who were with him. When he arrived at the scene, Debbie was already in the middle of a fight with the guards. As the onlookers were interested to see the outcome, they did not vacate the premises, and simply kept their distance by taking a few steps back every now and then. On the side, Curtis tried to talk Carlos out of his irrational decision, but the latter remained impervious to the principal's appeal. It had always been that way with him. Once Carlos made up his mind, no one could sway him, not even his best friend. When Warren Liu, Curtis' father, thought there were people causing trouble on the cruiser, he decided to send some professional bodyguards over. Determined, Debbie was able to knock down 7 security guards and 3 bodyguards before finally being subdued. It took 3 bodyguards just to restrain her on the floor. Although no one could say it out loud, it was quite an embarrassing sight to see. Nevertheless, it was enough to snap Jared out of his trance. The moment he tried to come to her aid, he was stopped by 2 other bodyguards. In his condition, he did not have the maximum capacity to fight back. It did not mean, however, that he would make it easy for them to detain him. "Let go of me. I have to help her," Jared said, struggling out of their grip. "Get out of my way. Otherwise, I'll kill you. Did you hear me? I'll kill all of." His voice trailed off as soon as he noticed Carlos staring at him. Closing his mouth, Jared watched the bodyguards drag Debbie out of the cabin. Like a flock of sheep, the crowd followed them. Clearly, they were enjoying the show. No one could care less how serious the whole matter was becoming. After all, the star of the show was the influential Mr. Huo. And now, he intended to have someone fed to the sharks. How often could one see that happen? Was it not exciting? Unlike the others, Curtis did not follow them. Before he walked out of the cabin, he whispered something to a few bodyguards. And when he passed by Jared, he gave him a comforting look, as if to say, "Take it easy," before running off to implement his plan. Although Curtis tried to calm Jared down, the latter still wrenched himself free from the hold of the 2 bodyguards. Without giving them a chance to grab him again, he ran out of the cabin. As soon as he reached the deck, all he heard was loud exclamations from the onlookers. "My goodness! She's really going to be thrown into the ocean. Whoa! Mr. Huo is so terrifying. How did the poor girl end up offending such a man? Humph! Whatever she's done, she probably deserved what's coming to her. Stupid woman. Even if Mr. Huo does throw her into the ocean, nobody is going to stand up to him. Ah, my God! They're about to drop her." Amidst the mixed reactions, Jared sought the lady who had caused such a turmoil. To his horror, he found Debbie with half of her body falling off the cruiser. Jared brushed past the onlookers and rushed towards her, shouting, "Release her! Carlos Huo, for Pete's sake, send your dogs away and let her go. This is too much. Ugh!" Just as he was about to approach Debbie, 2 bodyguards held him by shoulders. Out of the blue, one of them punched him hard in the stomach. It was so painful to a point where Jared could not utter another word for a while. "BN, your gateway to infinite stories." As he fell to his knees, he did not see what happened next with his own eyes. All he heard was a distinctive scream, and he knew he had failed to stop the inevitable from happening. Water flew in every direction as Debbie was thrown into the cold sea. Aghast, Jared lifted his head with an ashen face. As though in denial, he looked around first. His friend was really nowhere to be seen on the deck. No, he thought while panic crossed his face. Tomboy, Debbie. The initial shock gave him a burst of energy as he struggled to free himself. The moment he wriggled away from the bodyguards, he dashed to the rails and shouted to the ocean, "Debbie!" He squinted his eyes in the dark. Debbie. Nothing. No response. Neither could he see her as far as his eyes could reach. "Why are you all standing around? You idiots! Do something!" he yelled at the bystanders. The sea was as black as the sky. Soon it appeared serene once again. Deep and vast like an enormous sleeping beast, it only took several seconds to swallow a person. Weakened by the horrific incident, Jared punched the rails in anger. He hated himself for not knowing how to swim. "Tomboy, I'm so sorry. I. Some women screaming in shock brought him out of his own thoughts. Something was floating in the sea. Look, is that Debbie Nian? Someone in the crowd exclaimed, pointing somewhere in the water. It's really her. Look, she's held onto the boat. Turns out she can actually swim. When Jared looked around, he saw some faces in the crowd looking relieved to find out that Debbie could swim. Within a minute, Debbie clutched the rails and appeared before everyone, drenched from head to toe. As soon as her feet touched the deck, she spun back and spat a mouthful of water. Tasted salty. It had not completely sunk in yet that a moment ago, she could have died. After gasping a few times, she still could not breathe normally. Her eyes swept the crowd. Soon, she spotted Carlos, who was holding a glass of wine not far from her. The man looked at her with indifferent eyes, as though what she had just experienced was of little importance. She turned her head and spat more water. All good etiquette forgotten, she wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. There was no room for elegance when everything she wore was soaking wet, except for her high heels. They were long gone. Barefoot, she began to walk on the deck. Lifting her soggy dress, she wore an expressionless look while pushing away Jared as he tried to hug her. Something did not feel right as she walked straight to Carlos. Everyone on board held their breath. They wondered and waited in anticipation. What was Debbie going to do? Handing the wine glass to the waiter who was beside him, Carlos stared at the woman approaching him. His hands were deep in his pockets while his face showed no signs of worry. He raised an eyebrow at her, a hint of amusement in his eyes. Debbie Nian. The more I utter your name, the more it feels familiar, he thought to himself. Crazy. The woman must be crazy, remarked a man in the crowd. This is suicidal. Someone ought to stop her. She's so dead. How dare she treat my dream man that way, exclaimed a woman. Although everyone was certain that Debbie was up to something dangerous, nothing had prepared them for what the young lady did next. As Debbie drew closer to Carlos, she ran towards him and locked his neck with her arms like a koala clinging to a tree. Before anyone else could shake off their awe, she kissed him on the lips. When Jared realized what was happening, his eyes widened to the size of 2 plates. What? A bystander voiced his thoughts out loud. Kissing? This woman is just getting bolder and bolder. Anger became visible in Carlos' eyes. Even with the dim light, Debbie could clearly see it. It was just what she wanted to happen. From the moment her life was no longer in peril, she was enveloped with the desire to see him filled with rage. However, when the shock and anger began to wane, Carlos brought her closer to him and held her in his arms. The kiss lasted a long time, longer than Debbie predicted. What was actually happening was far from what she had imagined. Her lips were purple because of the cold. Carlos bent a little to carry her in his arms. Without so much as an explanation, he strode towards the lounge of the cabin. It was as though the whole world quieted down. Nothing but the soft waves could be heard. The people on the deck exchanged puzzled looks, yet nobody said a word. Some were too scared to voice out their thoughts. Others felt like it was a dream, while the rest were too furious to speak. In the third category among them was Olga. Meanwhile, in the lounge, Carlos kicked a door open and carried the woman into the room. In his arms, Debbie was too stunned to speak. Had she gone too far? The man seemed too dazed to pay attention to her facial expression. He kept the lights off. After putting her down on the floor, he kicked the door shut. Now that they were alone at last, he approached her and did what he felt like doing ever since the kiss on the deck. Her hands pressed behind her back. Debbie was trapped between him and the door whilst he explored her body. She could not move. Carlos, she observed, but it fell on deaf ears. She wanted to say, "Let go of me," but she never got the chance. "Let go of me." Finally, Debbie was able to speak. With a sneer, Carlos stopped what he was doing and pressed his head against hers. "You are too young to be doing this. Are you this desperate for money? How much is one night?" Money was the least of his problems. Even if he stopped working at that very moment, he would still have enough money to spend for the next 300 years. For a moment, fire spewed out of her eyes. Clenching her fists tightly, She took deep breaths to refrain from losing control. She forced a smile. It was a faint one, and in an instant it was gone. With her disheveled hair and her ragged breathing, Carlos found it enticingly beautiful. 100 million, she said through gritted teeth. The light in his eyes grew colder. Are you kidding me? You? Never in his wildest dreams did he imagine that he would have to spend a dime, let alone 1 million, just to sleep with the woman he so despised. Ironically, sometime later, when the time came that he did want to sleep with her, she would not even so much as spare him a glance. He just did not know that yet. He was, possibly for the first time, caught in such an odd dilemma. Debbie smiled wanly. Mr. Huo, hear me out, she said, but he shook his head once. I'm done with talking. Let me see if you're worth it, he countered. Whatever it was that she wanted to say, Carlos already knew that it was not worth hearing. Thus, he was not stupid enough to let another word escape her mouth. Damn, Debbie cursed internally. You evil man. Trying to maintain her smile, Debbie wrapped her arms around his neck. In the dark, their bodies appeared to fit perfectly like a puzzle as she pulled his body close to hers. The air in the room was so tempting. For a moment, Carlos seemed to be consumed with lust again. With her lips dangerously closing the gap between them, Debbie had him right where she wanted. Suddenly, she lifted a leg and kneed him in the groin. Groaning, Carlos closed his eyes in pain and bent down on the floor beside her. This time, the glint of happiness in Debbie's eyes was genuine. Did you really want to take advantage of me? Ha! Not going to happen, she thought. Mr. Huo, she remarked. I was trying to tell you that, even if you were to give me 100 million, she paused, and then flashed a scornful look. I would not sleep with you. Debbie fixed her wet dress casually. Then, she looked down at the man and said, See ya. When she turned to leave, however, Carlos grabbed her by the arm, his pale face filled with pain. With a raised eyebrow, she shoved his hand away, opened the door, and disappeared from his sight. At the moment, the lady with a smug face might feel great about what she had just done. But in the future, if and when she would meet Carlos again, she might as well escape as fast as she could. Why? Because he was not going to forgive her without a payback. Not far from the room, Curtis, Colleen, and Jared were biding their time with some security guards. If Debbie had stayed inside any longer, Curtis would have had to break in to get her. Fortunately, just as he was about to make a move, the lady in question emerged from the room. Debbie, Curtis called. Tomboy, Jared said, relieved. He advanced towards her and pulled her into his arms. Thank God you came out. We were going to break the door open. Then it dawned on him. He examined her carefully and asked, Did Carlos hurt you? No, she answered casually. If only you guys knew that he's the one who's hurting right now, she thought, gloating inwardly. Suppressing a smirk never felt more difficult for Debbie than that particular moment. She cleared her throat and glanced at everyone. They were simply relieved to hear her reply. So much so, no one noticed she was stifling a laugh. After taking one look at Debbie, Colleen took her into the lounge to change her clothes. Once the young university student was all cleaned up, Colleen and Curtis escorted Jared and her off the cruiser. They felt it was necessary in case they found themselves in trouble again. Have a good rest when you're back. I'll talk to Carlos later, Curtis informed her. Although he did not know what transpired in the room while they were alone, he was certain about one thing. After what Debbie did at the party, Carlos would not just forget it, and it would cost her. Thank you, Mr. Liu and Colleen. I'm sorry I ruined your party, Debbie apologized. It was not until then that she started to feel terrible for ruining the Liu group's party. Once again, she fell prey to Carlos' insensitive words, which led her to react irrationally. Now she realized that she should have just ignored him. Don't worry about it. I'll take care of it, Curtis declared genuinely. Now, go back and have some rest. Thank you, Mr. Liu. Good night, Debbie replied, giving a rueful smile. As soon as they got in, the Mercedes slowly drove away. When the car was no longer within sight, Colleen interlocked arms with Curtis and asked, Curtis, why didn't you just tell her the truth? The memory of an utterly confused Debbie played in his mind. He could not help but find it funny. "It's not the time yet," he answered. Shrugging, Colleen replied grudgingly, "Fine." With her hand in his, they went back to the party. Much later, when Curtis found Carlos, the latter was having a smoke in the dim room while staring at the dark sky through the window. Despite noticing Curtis step in, the man neither moved nor spoke. "Carlos, she is young. Don't be mad at her." The man's silence was the only response he got, because, secretly, Carlos was still in a lot of pain. By the looks of it, Carlos surmised that Debbie had not shared the most recent stunt that she had pulled on him. After a pregnant pause, Carlos began, "I'm not mad at her, not even a little." Poor Curtis. He did not even sense the sarcasm in his tone. The man nodded in relief. Turning to look outside once more, Carlos took another drag on his cigarette. The ZL group was more than efficient with the investigation. Within 2 short days, Gail's actions were discovered. As a result, she was expelled, with no chance of returning again. In addition, because of the high-reaching influence of the Economics and Management School of Y City University, no other school would ever admit any students who were expelled from it. This meant that the days of Gail as a university student was officially over. The incident was quite sensational in the university. Debbie, however, was not as surprised as the others. Making a video and playing it at the launch of the new products by ZL Group sounded pretty much like Gail's style. The foolish girl brought it all on herself when she tried to ruin Debbie's life. However, as much as Debbie wanted to see the girl punished for her actions, she thought of her aunt and uncle-in-law who were likely devastated by the news. With a helpless sigh, she decided to pay them a visit and console them. When she did enter the house, however, it was just as she had assumed. Sebastian Mu, Gail's father, was in a huge fit of fury. "Look at what you've done. How did I have such a dumb daughter as you?" he bellowed. "Thanks to you, not only is your future ruined, but now you've put my company in jeopardy as well. It's bad enough that you constantly pick on Debbie, but this time, you chose to mess with Mr. Huo." One of the housemaids brought Debbie into the living room. Due to everyone being caught up in the moment, no one noticed her presence. On the couch, Gail was weeping with her face covered with her hands. Beside the distraught girl was her mother, Lucinda Nian. Gaunt and miserable, Debbie's aunt had her head propped in one hand. The long green overcoat made her look paler than usual. After letting out a sigh, Debbie called Sebastian Mu lightly, "Uncle." The older man stopped berating his daughter upon hearing her voice. In a matter of seconds, his facial expression turned from anger to guilt when he saw Debbie. "Oh, Debbie, how long have you been here?" At the same time, Lucinda Nian woke up from her thoughts, eyes growing wide with recognition as she turned to look. The mature woman got to her feet and walked to her niece. She took her hand into her own lovingly, looked at Debbie up and down, and asked her out of concern, "Debbie, how are you?" Did Mr. Huo? Even though Lucinda Nian did not finish her question, Debbie already knew what her aunt really wanted to ask. Both her aunt's confession of love to Carlos as well as what happened on the cruiser had reached the ear of practically everyone in the upper-class world. Shaking her head in response, Debbie was about to say something when Gail cut in. "Why are you here? Did you come to mock me? You know what? Get out. You're not welcome here." "Gail Mu, shut up," Sebastian Mu yelled, boiling with anger. Being spoiled had made his daughter become such a disrespectful and ungrateful girl. Deep down, he felt like he was to blame for having enabled her bad behavior to go on neglected for too long. The stern expression on her father's face caused Gail to lean back, her head lowered timidly, but the look she shot at Debbie was as resentful as ever. "It was her fault that Mr. Huo was furious at me and got me expelled. Why do I have to sit around and watch her grovel for my parents' attention?" Gail thought to herself. By now, Debbie was used to Gail's irrationality. So, she ignored the death glare that was boring holes into her face and walked over to Sebastian Mu. Tugging at his sleeve, she began, "Uncle, don't be mad. I'm actually here because I was worried about Auntie and you." Truthfully, Debbie was more concerned about his health. Ever since she was little, she knew about Sebastian Mu's high blood pressure and myocardial infarction. Looking a little worn out, Sebastian Mu sat back on the couch and let out a long sigh. When will Gail ever be a good girl like Debbie? He thought. If his daughter could even be half as good as his niece, that would make such a huge difference. While Sebastian Mu appreciated Debbie's concern, Gail did not like being further painted as a bad daughter. Debbie, save your hypocritical flattery. They are my parents, she yelled, standing up with clenched fists. Your dad is dead and your mom abandoned you. The moment Gail's harsh words left her mouth, she was struck with a stinging slap in the face. A crisp sound reverberated around the room. It was Lucinda's hand that had slapped Gail across the cheek whilst Debbie stood there, expressionless. Venting her anger didn't seem to satiate Lucinda's anger. Picking up a feather duster, she swung it towards Gail. Ugh, Mom! As the duster hit her back, Gail screamed in agony. How revealing it was that she had acted weak, helpless, and innocent in front of her schoolmates. Now, her true colors showed that she was mean and willful. Watching everything happen right before him, Sebastian rubbed his temples with resignation and never interfered with his wife educating their daughter. Looking at her aunt who had always favored her, Debbie was moved. Her heart ached when she saw Lucinda disappointed and heartbroken. Never mind, she thought. Gail has already been punished. Seeing Lucinda raise the duster again, Debbie stepped in and prevented her from going further. Aunt, you've already hit Gail. I think she knows what she did wrong now. Debbie, stay out of this. You've pleaded for her so many times since you were little. Look at her. She never learned. Being the principal of a kindergarten, Lucinda was nice and able to control her temper, although her elder daughter Gail often drove her crazy. The younger daughter, Sasha Mu, had behaved better than Gail and even got along with Debbie. In the tea room, Gail had been sent upstairs to apply some ice on her face. Sebastian went to the tea room, took out a tin of black tea and began to wash the tea leaves. Sitting next to Lucinda, Debbie took out her phone and sent Carlos a message. You let Gail off easily just this once and I'll go to New York and talk with your grandfather about our divorce. Receiving no reply from him, she assumed that Carlos was busy. All three chatted sparsely until Sebastian received a call and had to leave to head to his company. After Sebastian had left, Debbie looked into the cup and recalled what Gail had said to her moments ago. Aunt, who's my mother? Why did my father refuse to tell me anything about her even on his deathbed? She asked lightly. When her father was knocking on heaven's door, he made sure to marry his daughter to a stranger instead of letting her search for her mother. The expression Lucinda wore changed abruptly at the topic. She placed the teacup on the table with so much force that half of the tea spilled, soaking the tea board. Don't ask about her. That woman is heartless. Forget about her, Lucinda answered in a gloomy tone. It was only days after Debbie had been born that her mother had abandoned her and her father, Artie. The dramatic reaction Lucinda had made got Debbie sewing her lips tightly. When Debbie was about to leave, Lucinda asked her in a low voice, Haven't you met him yet? Debbie knew her aunt was referring to Carlos. The thing was, her aunt knew she had married someone, but she never knew who it was. Unwillingly, Debbie answered in honesty, Yes, I have, but I want a divorce. I'm young and I don't want to be trapped in a nominal marriage. Surprised by her response, Lucinda nodded. All right, it's up to you. Whatever decision you make, I'm with you. Thank you, Aunt. Out of the Mu family, Debbie unexpectedly saw a kennel on the roadside, making her face darken. That kennel was the main reason she despised Gail so much. Half a day had passed, but Carlos hadn't returned her message yet. But later that day, she saw Gail on the campus, which meant she was back to school. It also meant it was time for Debbie to go to New York. Due to the timely treatment, Gail's face wasn't as swollen as earlier. With the help of makeup, one could hardly tell her face went through such damage. Eyeing Debbie gloatingly, Gail spat. You thought being Curtis' pet could get you a free pass, huh? Guess what? Curtis listens to Mr. Huo. Earlier, when her parents were having a conversation in their house, Gail had overheard that Carlos had agreed to allow her to go back to school. She didn't understand, though, why a person who had gotten her expelled was willing to help her back to school. Maybe it's because I'm pretty and he has a crush on me? And when he knew that it was me who got expelled, he tried to make it right. With this in mind, Gail couldn't keep her laughter in check. Everyone wished to have even a small connection with Carlos, and whoever did was treated highly, similar to humans praising a god. Hands buried in the pockets of her coat, Debbie cast Gail a scornful look and snarled, "Go away, you psycho, Mr. Lou wasn't part of it anyway," she sneered internally. "Debbie Nian, I'm telling you, it was Mr. Huo who asked the school to take me back. It was Mr. Huo, you hear me? The one who you confessed your love to and turned you down. Remember?" Gail blabbered like a twit. "Of course I remember him, 'cause he's my husband, you idiot." Debbie cursed inwardly. Gail was getting better and better at twisting the facts and making up her own stories. Debbie found, "You know better than anyone why I confessed my love to Carlos. Also, where did you get the idea that he turned me down?" She retorted. What? You mean he didn't turn you down?" Gail said, dismayed by Debbie's remarks. "Are you telling me that you slept with him?" she asked, starting to laugh again. "Well, isn't this amusing? Debbie Nian, please go look at yourself in a mirror. You'd be mistaken for a man. You expect me to believe that Mr. Huo likes you? Oh please, you might have had a better chance convincing me that pigs can fly." Knowing this was a waste of time, Debbie remembered that she had booked herself a flight to New York and had to make haste packing up her things back at the dorm. She also needed to go to the villa before heading for the airport. No way did she want to miss her flight. Not satisfied with how Debbie had reacted, Gail shouted, "Artie's dead! Debbie, you lost your backing. So why the hell are you so proud? Hun, is it because of Jared and Curtis? You think they have your back now? I'm not scared. They're just two men. Just wait and see. I'll marry someone richer and more powerful than your damn husband." Gail mentioning her father's name made Debbie look upward and gaze at the blue sky. Taking a deep breath, she finally responded, "No need for that. You've already lost." Indeed, that was a fact. Because in Y City, even the entire H country, who could compare to Carlos in terms of power and wealth? Nothing but best intentions in mind, her father had married her off to the best man. But sadly, it didn't work out between them. "Hey, what do you mean?" Gail rushed forward to grab Debbie. "Don't you dare go without clearing that up." A fist greeted her in response. "One more step and your face is mush." Knowing that Debbie possessed an extensive knowledge of martial arts, Gail stepped back to keep herself out of Debbie's reach. "I wonder what kind of pervert would actually like you. No wonder you've been single your whole life. You'll be an old maid forever," she declared furiously. "Do I really need a man to live my life?" Debbie retorted. The moment she got on the plane, a new rumor started circulating around the campus which claimed that Debbie was a lesbian. Again, her name became the hottest word on the forum of the Economics and Management School. In New York, before exiting the waiting area at the airport, she called Emmett to inquire about Carlos' grandfather's address. To her surprise, she received an address of a hospital. Hospital? Why is he in the hospital? What's wrong? She asked in confusion. At the other end of the line, Emmett paused a little to think. "Mrs. Huo, where are you?" he asked instead of answering her question. "Has she really gone to New York?" He thought to himself, a crease on his forehead. Trapped in his own musings, he heard Debbie say, "I'm in New York. I just got off the plane." Her voice trembled correspondingly, and then she added, "It's freezing cold out here." What she said was no exaggeration, and Emmett was more than aware. Back home, the climate was welcoming with the soft breeze of autumn. In New York, however, the temperature had dropped to several degrees below zero. The young lady did not sound like she had any idea until she was there. Emmett's mouth was agape in shock for a bit. He had not expected her to push through with going to New York by herself. "Mrs. Huo, please find someplace where you can have a cup of coffee first. In the meantime, I'll arrange a car for you right away." Despite the grave possibility of a divorce, as long as it was not finalized yet, Debbie still had every right to enjoy all the respect and proper treatment as Carlos' wife. That was clear to Emmett, and so he insisted on being of assistance to the young lady. Although she wanted to refuse, it was snowing heavily outside and she did not exactly have a better plan in mind. After giving it some careful thought, she turned to the side and entered the nearest coffee bar that caught her eyes. Just as Emmett kept true to his word, a car picked Debbie up to drive her to the hospital where the old man she was supposed to see was currently confined. Upon entering the ICU ward, Debbie eyed the old man lying in bed, with all kinds of tubes and apparatuses inserted into his skinny and frail body. The mere sight of the man's condition nearly broke her heart. "What happened?" Debbie asked in a soft whisper, turning to the driver who had brought her to the hospital from the airport. "Mr. Huo's grandfather has been in poor health for years," the driver began, his chauffeur cap in his hand. "He has been in a coma for over 3 years now. Ever since he got seriously ill, the man has not awakened from it." Looking at the motionless old man once again, Debbie could not help but feel every kind of sadness. Poor man, she thought to herself. At his age, instead of suffering alone in an ICU ward, he was supposed to be surrounded by his children and their respective families. Although he appeared to be receiving every possible means of comfort, it was still different than to be resting in his own home. She then sent a text message to Carlos. "Why did you not tell me about your grandfather's condition? If she had known about it, she might not have come to New York." The primary reason for her flying over had been to ask for an answer, but to her surprise, the old man could not even speak. Nevertheless, since Carlos and she were still married, strictly speaking, the old man was also her grandfather by law. Perhaps it was a good thing that she had come to see him after all. Otherwise, she would never have guessed about his current situation. Turning to the driver, she asked, "Who's taking care of Mr. Huo's grandfather?" "Professionals, I hear. He's provided with around-the-clock care," the driver explained, squinting as though he were trying to recall. "Mr. Huo and his parents often come to check on him as well." After asking a few more questions, Debbie left the hospital. While waiting outside for the car, she stretched out her right hand to catch some snowflakes until her hand went numb with the cold. Experience the magic of words. Thanks to Emmett making arrangements while she was at the hospital, Debbie could stay at a place which Carlos owned in New York, at least just until she returned back home. It was not until she walked into the room that she learned the villa was where Carlos lived whenever he came to New York. A few personal items could be found neatly propped in their respective places, some suits in the closet being one of the things which she noticed. Although Emmett was thoughtful in his actions, it was a pity that Carlos and Debbie were not meant to be together. Having flown for more than 10 hours, after which she had headed directly to the hospital, it was no wonder that she felt the exhaustion overcoming her. By the time she sat on the bed, she did not want to move a single muscle anymore. However, when it dawned on her that this was not her own bedroom, but Carlos, and that she would be sleeping in his bed, she mustered what was left of her energy and dragged herself into the bathroom. As soon as she finished taking a shower and changing into clean clothes, she plopped onto the bed and fell asleep the moment her head touched the pillow. On the other side of the world, Carlos was still at work in the ZL group. He was putting aside some finished files when he saw the text message from Debbie. "You didn't ask," he replied. When he had received her message about letting Gail off easily the day before, he had been at a loss for words. Despite the lady being the one who was asking for a divorce, her message felt as though he was the one who wanted to get out of their marriage. More importantly, where had she gotten the nerve to propose terms and conditions? After sending the message, Carlos turned to Emmett and asked in a flat tone, "How's everything with her in New York?" "Her? New York?" For a moment, Emmett was confused as his thoughts were preoccupied with his work responsibilities. "Oh, right," he thought suddenly. It finally occurred to him whom Carlos was asking about. After her visit to the hospital, Mrs. Huo went to the villa on Mountain Avenue. Right now, she is likely resting in the villa. Without lifting his eyes from the files before him, Carlos asked again, "When is she coming back?" "I didn't ask. Mrs. Huo hasn't booked a return ticket yet," Emmett answered. The man intertwined his fingers on the desk and looked at him once more. "Postpone everything tomorrow on my schedule," Carlos said. "Book a ticket to New York for me." There were a few things he had to do anyway. 1, he wanted to pay his grandfather a visit. And 2, he preferred to talk with his wife about their divorce in person. It was better not to delay either of those matters, he thought to himself. Yes, Mr. Huo. Initially, Debbie had planned to have some fun in New York before flying back home. But later on, she had received a message from Gail out of the blue. It was regarding Lucinda. She had gotten into an accident. As soon as she read it, she called Sebastian to check on her aunt's situation. Her uncle did not sound too distressed. "It's not that bad," he said in a comforting voice. But despite Sebastian's reassurance, she was still worried. After the phone call, she quickly packed her things and went to the airport. The moment she got on the homeward-bound plane, Carlos' plane just landed in New York. But due to a curious twist of fate, they missed their chances of having their first meeting as a married couple, ironically to discuss their divorce. 6 days later, Carlos came back from New York as well, but he did not have any time to rest. A meeting with an important client had been scheduled at Orchid Private Club. As soon as he got off the plane, he had to head straight to the venue if he wanted to arrive on time. The night fell. A Bentley sped past along the road. Due to the evening rush hour, they were stuck in a traffic jam that extended all the way to the intersection. The car wasn't going anywhere anytime soon. Carlos rolled down the car window and lit a cigarette. Tired, he took a drag on the cigarette to elevate his spirits. While his car was not moving, Carlos saw a bunch of people fighting in a lane. 7 men had cornered a woman against a wall. Something about the scenario felt oddly familiar. When he saw who the woman was, Carlos coughed out a mouthful of smoke which hid the look in his eyes. The conflict amongst the 8 people did not last long. When one of the 7 men raised a hand, the young lady deftly kicked him who was going to strike her. Emmett, who was becoming uneasy in the car, worried that his boss might get impatient and lash out on him. He fidgeted in his spot and his eyes wandered around in the streets as well. His eyes widened when he saw the commotion. In a surprised voice, he exclaimed, "Mr. Huo, isn't that?" The shock made him stutter. "Isn't that Debbie Nian?" Once Emmett was certain that it was indeed Debbie, he could not believe his eyes. The woman was fighting alone against 1, 2, 3, 7 men. Debbie was in a fight against 7 men. While stubbing out the cigarette, Carlos exhaled the last mouthful of smoke and demanded, "Shut up!" No one needed to tell him who the lady was. Even from afar, he had quickly recognized that it was Debbie in another brawl. Does she have nothing else better to do? He thought, scowling. Emmett opened the door and was about to get out of the car when he heard his boss' cold voice. "If you get out of the car," Carlos began, "don't bother getting in again." Frozen, Emmett stopped himself just in time. His mind was reeling. Under the firm gaze of his boss, the conflicted man could only utter, "But," even though his hesitance was clear, Carlos did not respond. He was not worried about the woman's well-being. If he remembered correctly, she had kicked the asses of 9 well-trained security guards during the Liu family's party before. Lighting a second cigarette, Carlos turned to Emmett. "Start walking to the club." "I'm going to park the car somewhere first," he said indifferently. "Tell the client I'm on the way." The club was not too far from where they were. If they continue the rest of the trip by car, they would need to make a detour. On foot, however, the distance would be shorter. While gripping on the door tightly, Emmett was confused by his boss' sudden change of heart. Whatever Carlos was up to, Emmett did not have the courage to disobey his orders. Bouncing out of the car, he closed the door and briskly made his way towards the Orchid Private Club. In the lane, Debbie was panting with her hands on her knees. The hooligans whom she was fighting with had run away. The only reason she went there was to use the bathroom. How unfortunate of her that she ended up running into those losers. This neighborhood belonged to Orchid Private Club. Generally, it was quite safe over here. That was why Christina had chosen to sing in this neck of the woods. Hence, Debbie presumed those hooligans must have taken someone's money and were working for someone. Alas, she had let them get away. Now she had no leads as to who had hired them. Then, as Debbie stood up straight in a calm manner, steady yet heavy footsteps could be heard from behind her. Even after a fierce fight and somewhat exhausted, her entire body was on full alert again. When she felt that the person was within close range, she slashed her hands swiftly towards him. But before she could touch the person, he moved behind her at the same moment she had turned around. Struck with surprise, Debbie narrowed her eyes in suspicion. She had studied martial arts for 10 years. Through a single move, she could tell that the person behind her, whomever he might be, was a professional. Whether it was the security guards on the cruiser or the hooligans she had just dealt with, this man could easily handle them with one hand. On the other hand, she had exerted most of her strength with both hands. Even worse, she had not even seen his face yet. Was he a friend or a foe? And if he was the latter, did she just meet her match?